Welcome to the MedTalks webinar series where you can learn from entrepreneurs, industry experts and healthcare professionals who are driving progress in healthcare across the globe. I am Gemma Faldon and today we are joined by Dr. David Luke, Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of Greenwich. He specialises in psychology of exceptional human experience and has researched altered states of consciousness, particularly through psychedelics. With 100 academic papers and 13 books, he is a leading voice in the field. In this episode, we will explore the role of psychedelics in psychotherapy and mental health, along with the legal issues surrounding their use, plus the latest research and developments. Let's dive in. Lovely. Well, thank you very much for coming on today. I was really keen to get you on, having been on my own journey with psychedelics before over the years and following closely how the world of psychedelics has become much more mainstream, I would say, in the last few years, particularly in scientific research, which you clearly have been at the forefront of. How did it all start for you? Like, why did you get into psychedelic research? What was the beginning?
Well, I guess dabbling around with my brain like a neurochemistry playset as a teenager kind of led me to go and study psychology, actually, to try and understand psychedelic experiences. And of course, was woefully disappointed by what we were taught on a psychology degree, which didn't include anything about psychedelic experiences. So I became an academic and researched this area largely by default because there was such a dearth of any kind of existing information about it out there or anything being taught. So just attempting to fill the gap that I was seeking when I went to university, really.
That makes sense. And what, because I'm just seeing more research coming out of that Imperial actually around depression and its uses in mental health. Could you give us a bit of an overview on what research you've done and how you think it could help these people?
Yeah, so I mean, my own research is more kind of nuts and bolts psychology really than clinical applications per se. But there has been like a growing body of clinical research that's been conducted, around the world in the last 10, 15 years, particularly in this psychedelic research renaissance, looking at depression, treatment of anxiety, addictions, PTSD, OCD, eating disorders, end-of-life existential fear. And all of that research with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is showing like great promise. They're yet to get licensed as medicines anywhere apart from in Australia. And so my research is a bit ancillary to that. I'm interested in like, mostly what are the kind of underlying psychological mechanisms and after effects and what things predict the kinds of experiences and outcomes that people will have in their experiences, basically.
How does it work? What changes do psychedelics create in the brain?
So in the brain, there's a few things we understand, or at least we think we understand. It's a very complex organ, as you might be aware. But generally speaking, there are some functional changes which occur. So there's a part of the brain called the default mode network, which is kind of loosely associated with your ego or kind of sense of kind of control. When we're self-referentially thinking about what am I going to do in a minute? What did I just do a minute ago? That's our default mode network in action. And it seems the action of psychedelics reduces the activity in this part of the brain. In fact, there's no increases in activity anywhere in the brain on psychedelics, which was a massive surprise when it was discovered because everyone thinks, oh, you're having this explosive experience. There's got
Yeah.
to be more brain activity. Actually, the opposite. So it's like the brain ordinarily works by constraining experience, right? It just kind of keeps everything kind of really tightly controlled and allows you to perceive certain things and filters out everything else. And psychedelics act to take off that control and filter mechanism and lead to the brain having this much greater interconnectivity, or the suddenly all the different parts of the brain are all chatting away to each other like long lost friends. Um, and so you get this kind of overwhelming, explosive experience, and things like synesthesia, where you're getting your kind of senses um, co-interacting, like you can taste shapes and see sounds and things like that. And it also frees up a lot of unconscious material. So people start remembering traumas and childhood memories, their motives, drives, fears, everything comes up basically. And that can be enormously therapeutic in and of itself. It can also help fuel psychotherapy, bring material into psychotherapy as well. So it's a kind of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, um, and the two kind of go together, based on the idea of this kind of this wealth of material coming up, and also the beneficial effects of having the experience itself. That's kind of it. I kind of jumped around all over the place
And
there.
no, that makes sense. Thank you. And do the changes in the brain and everything that's happening during a psychedelic experience, do they then continue after that experience, would you say?
So there hasn't been too much work done on long-term effects and changes. We do see some functional differences. So perhaps people who are more kind of front heavy, may have reductions in frontal lobe activity. This frontal lobe activity is usually associated with depression, anxiety, this kind of rumination, just kind of going
Yeah.
over the day, kind of self-defeating ideas in your brain, and so it's like a kind of psychic snow globe. It just shakes it all up. We also see what's called neuroplasticity changes as well. So there's an increase in brain connections, new brain cell growth, new dendrites, etc., which is thought to be a really positive dimension. It's like you're effectively uh, reorganizing your brain and throwing in some new brain growth in the process, which can be highly beneficial, but it also depends what happens in that period of plasticity, right? It in a held context with the therapist, and it can help you kind of engender new positive thought patterns rather than the traditional negative ones. But it can also lead some people to go down rabbit hole of other negative thoughts, like perhaps people may have got paranoid in their trip, or perhaps just maybe even slightly traumatized by their experience. Now they're very much in the minority, but
Yeah.
generally speaking, neuroplastic effects lead to kind of, we think, to positive outcomes.
And I'm assuming do you see that more when you have got a therapist sitting with someone going through a psychedelic experience?
Well, interestingly, so that kind of direct comparisons hasn't been done. It's very hard to control for. A lot of the research focuses around the drug, it's the dosage, and less the type of therapy and how much and all the rest of it. So that's still a big unanswered question. We presume the psychotherapeutic element helps. It certainly is an ethical consideration, because if somebody's having this really wild, explosive experience, you probably want somebody to help them integrate that. But we also see, like, when people take psychedelics out of the clinical context, we also see beneficial effects to well-being anyway, when people taking them recreationally
Yeah.
or in retreat settings. The majority of people report kind of enhanced well-being as well in those kind of unsupported environments. But obviously that's not very good for a clinical model.
Yeah, I mean, I see it more and more now with the literature that I read and the people that I speak to. More people have had experiences with psychedelics that have found it really, really beneficial and tough. It has been certainly for myself every time I've gone on those experiences. It's been pretty tough. I'm not going to lie, but it's been the most profound experience for me, for sure. Why do you think more people are turning to psychedelics now?
I think we saw a change in attitudes and media representations. So somewhere about the early noughties, we stopped getting, I mean, psychedelics had kind of gone off the radar, from the 70s onwards. And then by the noughties, we stopped really seeing kind of negative news reports. It's like it's
Mm,
just dead subject, really, in a way. But then scientists and clinicians started doing research with them and started reporting on their beneficial effects in therapy and psychiatry. And we started seeing more and more of these positive news stories coming out about the massive overlooked potential of psychedelics for mental health and well-being. And increasingly more and more news reports, and then more and more people obviously interested in taking them. And so we've seen this, yeah, hand in hand, the rise of the clinical research and the science and the number of people taking psychedelics, and also them becoming more mainstream and acceptable. So those two things go hand in hand, really. But yeah,
What are the legalities of psychedelics? You mentioned about Australia legalizing them, is that right?
not legalizing them.
Oh,
So they have licensed them as medicines, basically. Well,
ah,
psilocybin and MDMA, just those two.
okay,
Psilocybin for depression, MDMA for PTSD. So
really?
that's the country in the world to do that. They don't have medical license anywhere else in the world. And so that's a different kind of legal category to, you know, being legalized or decriminalized. In some parts of the world, they're being decriminalized or legalized as well. Some states in the US. But the only medical license so far applied is in Australia 2 years ago now. Exactly
Okay.
two.
Why do you think they're leading ahead in medical licensing?
I mean, it's an interesting story when you drill down into it. I think there was just a good kind of PR campaign and some good lobbying to the government. Basically, I think primarily based on the principle that there'd been some public surveys done amongst the voting populace, and something like 90% of the people were in favor of at least discussions about drug policy reform around psilocybin for mental health, and almost nobody was opposed to it. And suddenly
Right.
the politicians pricked up their ears quite immediately, and a group of lobbyists and psychiatrists and mental health professionals proposed that this new legislation, and it went through quite quickly. So, when politicians realize it's a vote winner slash vote loser if they don't do something about it, they very quickly change the legislation.
So they get voting on psychedelics, we get voting on Brexit. That's not fun.
Yeah, 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 I know. That's politics for it, isn't it? But the same thing's happened in the UK. There was a YouGov poll 3 or 4 years ago now, and it was, past the tipping point where the majority of the population in the UK, voting population, were in favour of revisiting drug policy reform for psilocybin for medical purposes. And there's now a kind of working group, cross-party working group in Parliament, which is trying to, bring that forward. So
Mm,
slowly happening in the UK even.
yeah. And what we hear, or I read a lot about microdosing. Do you have much research on microdosing? What are your thoughts around that?
Well,
In fact,
microdosing.
actually,
Well,
sorry, I apologize. We should probably go back a little bit for our listeners as to what microdosing is.
yeah, yeah, I have a lot to say about that. But microdosing, technically speaking, from a clinician's or scientist's point of view, is taking psychedelics at a sub-threshold level, at a dosage at which you can't perceive any subjective experience. You're basically not tripping. You don't feel like you're tripping. And at least that's how scientists define it. And the idea is, this became very popular, particularly in Silicon Valley in the last couple of decades, that you take psychedelics not quite every day, but every 2 3 days or every other day to give you a little washout period, a bit like psychovitamins, that these things can work at very low doses where you can't feel it, but they have this kind of potential positive benefit, perhaps through enhancing neuroplasticity or whatever. And some of that early kind of democratic public science, in a way, look, kind of surveyed people doing this, users, of which there was thousands. And, people tended to report they had better focus at work, and they were, more productive, and like had less depressive symptoms or anxious symptoms. Actually, some of them found anxiety went up a little bit. Um, and so, like, on the face of it, it looked like, most people reported positive benefits from microdosing. And then me and old scientists got involved and started doing kind of more controlled, rigorous studies with randomized, double-blind conditions. And we were still seeing some positive effects, but we were also seeing them in the placebo condition as well, primarily.
Right. Okay.
Or if the effects were better with the drug, they tended to be where people had broken the blind, where if you ask them, do you think you're on the experimental drug or the placebo? And they go, yeah, I'm on the experimental drug, I think. And they tend to report more benefits. So it seems to be a mixture of expectation and kind of feedback from the experience. A lot of it seems to be. Now, there may be some differences as well, because when, out in the wild, in the natural world, when people microdose, that they may have a slightly different definition of microdosing to the strict clinical definition, where you're not supposed to feel anything. And because, when I speak to my friends and other people who have tried microdosing, they go, oh, yeah, I tried microdosing, but I didn't really feel very much. So I just took a little bit more, and they're basically slightly tripping at work. Uh, having a really great night. Um, so it's hard to tease out how much of it is expectation. And if you think about it, but what we're seeing from high dose psilocybin work, where most of the clinical work has been done, people, it's astonishing findings, two-thirds of people having remission from depression for a few weeks and months, and then it kind of tapers off and comes back, or two-thirds of tobacco smokers giving up smoking for a year, and
Wow.
so on. So these are really strong results with strong experiences. And so it's got a lot of expectation attached to it. It's like you can take this really potent substance, which will give you a mind-blowing experience and a smash your depression for 6 months, but you can take it at a tiny quantity where you don't have to trip balls and deal with all of that, fallout. And that, it's like a placebo on steroids, basically.
Mm.
Like, it's got inbuilt a lot of expectation attached to it. So yeah, trying to tease apart how much of that is expectation and how much is the drug effect is been challenging, and seems to fall mostly in the expectation camp.
So what then was the dosaging that you were using in the studies?
I'm more of a macro dose researcher.
Yeah, that's what I mean for the macro dosing. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've been enrolled in low dose and micro dose and even large dose studies, and yeah, I mean, in the clinical research, when it's used to treat depression, anxiety, OCD, all this stuff, tend to be high doses, uh, um, therapeutic doses, we call them. So it's hard to kind of put into layman's terms, but for instance, for those people who are used to know about taking mushrooms, a clinical therapeutic dose would be like 3.5 to 4 dried grams of mushrooms, which is a strong dose. You definitely know you're tripping. At those kinds of doses, like two-thirds of people will have a mystical experience. They'll kind of like feel total connection with everything, unity consciousness, transcending time and space, um, touching on the noetic quality of reality, where they feel like they've tapped into the deep underlying truth about the nature of reality and having some kind of spiritual experience, right? So this is not a microdose we're talking about. This is having like full-blown psychedelic experiences.
And does it go on a patient's size, weight, anything like that, or is it just straight out macro dose?
That's a good question. Now, we used to think that body weight was important, and in a lot of these studies, until recently, they would always report, they'd give them dosages of like milligrams per kilogram of body weight. Turns out that's completely irrelevant. because we have different density of serotonergic receptors, we have different metabolisms, and weight is actually irrelevant. We don't know what factors are important or how to predict them necessarily. There could be also genetic differences as well. And so, it's quite a truism that you can be at an ayahuasca ceremony and, a very svelte young woman will drink 3 or 4 cups and barely feel anything. And somebody like myself will just look at half a cup and will be absolutely cosmic. So there's weight's kind of irrelevant.
Yeah, no, I can relate to that for sure, definitely. Yeah. And does someone's experience level of experience while they're on psychedelics correlate to the benefits or not after they've had that experience?
That's an interesting question. It doesn't seem to, although, a lot of these clinical trials, they don't work usually with populations of people who have had many experiences or they particularly monitor it. Um, but in terms of like negative experiences that occasionally happen, it's not so much how many trips you've had, it's more about the context.
Yeah.
These things are really context specific. It's not just the substance, it's what we call the set and the setting as well. It's like where you're at mentally when you come to the experience and the environment in which you do it. Those are important factors. So feeling safe and prepared, feeling mentally prepared, having like good support around you, those kind of things are better predictors of the outcome than our experience necessarily, right? And
Mm.
clinical populations, they're mostly naive to psychedelics. They may never have taken psychedelics at all. So yeah, that prior experience factor doesn't usually kind of get factored in. And often they screen out people in these clinical trials who may have had prior experiences because that might be a confound in the outcomes. So
Yeah. I have to say, with my experiences, even though they've been tough, afterwards, like I just felt amazing for a long, long time. The effects lasted, really did last. It's like it made room for a whole nother perspective and shedded a load of crap, basically.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's what we hear. That's what we hear all the time.
Yeah.
You feel like an afterglow period, like kind of feel really kind of good and elevated and joyous and all the rest of it. That lasts like a couple of weeks, usually, maybe up to a month. And then in terms for those people with clinical symptoms, like depression or anxiety, we usually see big drop-offs in depressive and anxious symptoms, and that'll last, usually 3 to 6 months. And then for the majority of them, that'll kind of creep back up. And then
Mm.
for about, say, a quarter of them, that they'll have complete remission. So they may only need one big dose experience. For the rest, they probably start to see symptoms returning 3 to 6 months, and maybe they need to, like taking your car in for an MOT, really. You
Yeah.
maybe periodic kind of resets, if you like, might be the way forward.
I get
Yeah.
that. Have you had
Yeah.
any surprises
Uh,
with the
I mean,
research?
yeah, personally and professionally, but um, I mean, some of the surprises were, in the neuroscience that initially 15 years ago that there was no increases in brain activity. That was a big surprise. Some interesting stuff coming through now that this hasn't got any clinical data to support it, but I'm coming across people reporting profound effects with so like non-psychiatric conditions like cluster headaches. We already
Mm.
know that people with cluster headaches report a lot of benefit, say from taking magic mushrooms. It reduces the
Oh,
frequency and intensity of their headaches. But then some people have been reporting now that they're able to abort cluster headaches, which are known as suicide headaches. They're
yeah.
um, some people are able to abort their cluster headaches in the moment instantly by vaporizing DMT. So that could be, a really important avenue. People reporting reductions of Parkinsonian symptoms, psilocybin seemingly beneficial in brain trauma injury recovery as well, traumatic brain injury.
Interesting.
That there's neuroprotective qualities to some psychedelics as well. So like DMT in animal models seem to reduce stroke damage. So we might be seeing paramedics with kind of DMT EpiPens for, people who have had strokes. That'd be interesting.
Wow.
Uh, it raises all manner of questions. Uh, that they have really high anti-inflammatory properties, some of them, more than, pretty much anything else we know of currently, which, has a broad range of potential uses in medicine. So like non-psychiatric uses as well that may be developed from psychedelics are starting to emerge as well. So
Has that data come from in the intention of looking at those areas, or has it just come out on the back of researching other areas, and then you can see actually it's preventative of X, Y, and Z, it helps with headache clusters, or
no, it's not that kind of incidental data in a way. It's usually, and pretty much all of the psychedelic science and clinical research is kind of it's kind of citizen science. It's coming from users first and foremost, and people who are self-medicating, and then you get a bunch of anecdotes, which turns into data. It turns into kind of a collection of accounts of people reporting benefits, which then translates into clinical research, which finds harder evidence for these apparent effects. So yeah, it typically starts off with people, usually illegally, I have to say, self-medicating and reporting benefits for certain conditions. I thought, it's not a panacea. They're not panaceas, these things, but it does seem to be an interesting range of conditions which may benefit from taking psychedelics.
do you think we'll see it in the NHS?
Right, that's the $1 million question. It's probably costing much more than that. And I mean, that's a lot to do with kind of the politics of how the NHS is run and
Yeah.
funded. Um, there are arguments that, okay, relative to, say, let's take the example of depression, right? Relative to depression, that, we've got fairly cheap treatments for depression, SSRIs, maintenance drugs cost about 50p a day. Not particularly effective, however, right? And so you have to weigh up costs against effectiveness, and it depends on how you model it. So Paul McCrone, a professor in my school at the University of Greenwich, did a health economical analysis of pros and cons of psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy versus SSRIs. And based on the initial data, the psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy looks to be more effective. And so that you have to, if you factor in the benefits to society as opposed to the actual cost to the NHS, if you think of it as a kind of full-scale economic model, like costs to the British economy, for instance, psilocybin comes out as potentially, better than SSRIs, right? If it is as effective as it looks. It was all well and good giving people maintenance drugs, which aren't particularly effective, but may help alleviate some symptoms, as opposed to lots of people getting more benefit and longer lasting results and being able to kind of get back to work and find more purpose and meaning in life, but at a little bit more cost because it's quite costly to staff a 4 to 6 hour therapeutic session
Yeah.
and pre and post, psychotherapeutic follow-up. Psychotherapy costs money, so, but if it's more effective, the cost to the economy generally will be more beneficial. It'll be less costly to the global to the national economy. However, the direct cost to the NHS may make it prohibitive to actually adopt, and that's my kind of feeling. It's like, are we going to see it on the NHS? No, maybe not. But
Yeah.
will people be able to get referred to it for private treatment? Yes, probably. So initially, it might well be private treatment.
So given the data at the moment versus the legalities and the accessibility of it, if people are interested in exploring psychedelics now, where would you point them to?
So that's an interesting and tricky one. There's no real one resource. Uh, so for instance, if you're looking to get treatment, the only way currently to get access to any kind of psychedelic assisted treatment in the UK is through a clinical drug trial. So if there's a clinical study looking at your particular condition, there's currently trials with looking at OCD, eating disorders, depression, etc. You could sign up to. Um, Getting actual treatment outside of a clinical drug trial is not currently available, other than ketamine, which is a licensed medicine. There's ketamine assisted psychotherapy. That's also a bit thin on the ground. You
Yeah, I
can get
think we had a clinic in Bristol actually that did ketamine therapy. I don't know if it's still
that
about,
one's no longer open. I do
is
think
it?
there is a branch of that open in London. There's called
Right.
Awake. I don't know if it's still called Awaken. And then there's Paul McCrone in Oxford runs a ketamine clinic. It's ketamine treatment though. It's not ketamine assisted psychotherapy. There's no psychotherapy goes with it. It's just infusions of ketamine primarily for depression. So there's not much provision for access currently. Lots of people are going off to countries in Europe where it is, not illegal to do that. And you
Mm,
can't take it directly for a medical treatment, but people are going there and going on retreats in Portugal and Spain and Holland. If they do that, you could probably get some psychotherapy from therapists in the UK. You know that there are lots of psychedelic assisted psychotherapists in the UK, or qualified therapists who will help people integrate their experiences. There's a register of therapists on the Institute for Psychedelic Therapy website. Um, and then there's people self-medicating really.
mm.
If you're interested in like learning more, there's lots of good resources online. There's our psychedelic research conference in April at University of Exeter called
Yeah, I was
Breaking.
going to ask you about that breaking. I've not been. I really want to go. Tickets, last time I looked, I don't think tickets were released.
No, they are now. They're on sale. If you're interested, it's a deep dive. It's
Okay.
3-day conference. There's usually more than 100 presentations. We have 3, 4, 5 parallel sessions going, and then workshops, and then art installations and music and all kinds of things. So it's like an academic conference with a festival feel, and yeah, a really overwhelming amount of really important information. So do go if you can. That's a really great resource as well. And
Cool. Well,
meet.
it sounds like my kind of conference.
Yeah, no, it's a conference like no other academic conference. So,
Cool. All right.
yeah,
Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you coming on, and I could talk to you all day about this, and we could have took it in lots of different directions. And so, yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing the feedback. And thanks for pointing us in the right direction for more information too.
thanks, Gemma. Thanks for having me on board. Maybe you'll have to ask me back. We carry on the conversation sometime. But
I would
yeah,
absolutely love to. Cool. Thank you very much.
thank you, Gemma.
If you enjoyed today's episode, subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who might find it useful. You can find all the resources we talked about today, including links to the studies and tools, in the show notes on LinkedIn, X, TikTok, and YouTube. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We really appreciate your support and love hearing from you.